Hello. Wanted to just touch on a couple things in regards to our history of logistics document that I posted on Google Classroom for you. Before any of you glaze over too terribly soon, I should let you know that I think it is important to at least understand at least a little bit about the past. We're not going to be spending a great deal of time on this. In fact, we're going to pretty much move through this. Then all of a sudden we'll be in the 20th century, and then we'll start talking about modern type things. But before we can get to that, I really want to touch on logistics before 1850. I mean, it's sometimes difficult for people to understand that don't know history how things were so drastically different than what they were actually today. I mean, there was very little in the way of mixing of various cultures. People were together, or they kept to themselves. There was no mixing together. People over here did their thing, people over here did their thing, and there just wasn't much in the way of trade back and forth between a lot of these places. And aside from that, I mean, basically food was, I guess, for the most part, subsistence. There wasn't an excessive amount of food. It's not like you could walk into a supermarket and see vast quantities of food. I mean, life in general was difficult, and it was really, I hate to say it, but I mean, life was for the most part very, very, very difficult throughout the world up until a lot of the 1900s. And it's only then that parts of the developed world did start to get things in a position where they did start to have excessive amounts of food. You also had things were made, there was no mass production. If people wanted to make a wagon, they made one wagon. There really wasn't much in the way, and it was just in their culture. Again, there was no trade back and forth. Same thing went with services. So, a couple of things that are worthwhile noting. Some of you may have heard of Alexander the Great. In his time, probably one of the absolute largest empires, only to be eclipsed later by the Roman Empire. But I will tell you, I mean, this was a massive empire that stretched all the way from Greece to modern day India. And it was only then that, with this widespread movement, that you started to get a where there was, let's dismiss that, we start to get to a point where you started to had to think about moving things around, because there were actually, I mean, Alexander, he conquered other cultures that were nearby them. So as a result, a lot of times he had to bring things with him to continue to conquer. Um, let's see. Then there was the Persian Empire. I mean, some of you might be thinking, "Oh, that was that movie with the, it was that Spartan movie with the 300," and that was the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was found pretty much in the modern day Middle East. It was very expansive, and again, this was something, just because it was so large and they took over a number of their neighbors, that there started to be some trade back and forth, and movement of product had to be thought about over great distances. One of the biggest things that the Persian Empire had to think about at the time was the invasion of Greece. And ultimately, it was this invasion of Greece that ended up causing them a lot of problems, because they had soldiers that were attempting to attack the Greeks, and there were shortages of a number of things that led to their defeat by a much smaller group of Greeks. Additionally, they had a very large army, so there were just shortages galore that caused the Persian Empire to fail in their attempt to invade Greece, and then ultimately their power was diminished. as history went on. But it wasn't really until the Roman Empire that the idea of trade and movement of goods and services started to really take hold. There was movement around the Roman Empire of a whole variety of things. I mean, it was quite easy to do. There were roads. The Romans were a very organized groups of individuals. They had engineers. They had a whole variety of individuals that were specialists, that they not only spread their trade throughout the Roman Empire, but then there were spreading of commodities from one part of the empire to the other. And it took a great deal of effort to move things, but it was made much easier because of the fact that there were actually roads. This was the first time that there were roads in history. So, I mean, it was definitely a very unique time period. And because of this, it's one of the reasons that the Romans were indeed such a very strong, powerful empire. And because of that, we started to get individuals that specialized in moving things from place to place. I mean, there were modern day trucking companies where they had individuals that were moving things great distances via horse and wagon. That really was unheard of in the time before the Roman Empire. But as you know, the Roman Empire did not last forever. The Roman Empire eventually failed, and one of the reasons that it failed was there were a number of individual cultures outside of the Roman Empire that wanted all of the stuff that the Romans had. One of these groups of individuals were the Mongols. Okay, the Mongols, I mean, they were a group of people from what I would call Central Asia, a part to the east, or pardon me, yeah, to the east of Turkey. And these individuals were very self-sufficient, but they had very advanced abilities to move what product they did take with them very efficiently. Now, granted, these were very tough, hardy types of individuals. They were living a very rough lifestyle, but still, this transportation and movement around the globe by this particular group of individuals, the Mongols, really exposed the ideas of this movement to other individuals who they crossed paths with, individuals that were still outside of the Roman Empire. But this attack by outsiders like the Mongols uh, in the period of the Roman Empire eventually brought the Roman Empire down. And we then fell into a time period known as the Dark Ages. Dark Ages, again, everyone that was previously interacting with neighboring cultures and moving around the Roman Empire, it really ceased to exist, and everybody went back into their shell. And I hate to say it, this lasted for a good number of years. We're talking close to 800 some years, where much of the West, and primarily I talk about Europe here, pretty much moved inward and we're not moving around a great deal. So this is oftentimes referred to as the Dark Ages. And it wasn't really until the 1800s when all of a sudden there was a gentleman named Napoleon who was a general. He was a French general, and he brought with him a great deal of number of military tactics that allowed him to move things around very quickly, and it allowed him to conquer many of his neighbors that just did not have this type of capacity to move things around, to be able to react quickly. And these were all things that Napoleon and his armies were able to utilize to their advantage. And it's one of the reasons that they were so successful in eventually conquering, for the most part, much of Europe. What they did was they began to actually, as they moved and conquered individuals, they started to set up what were known as magazines, or more or less supply depots that could easily then be restocked, and they would serve as modern day distribution centers and how they would supply the individuals. There were also very extensive wagon trains that were used to move both food and equipment for Napoleon's armies. Okay, but it was a very efficient type of setup that the French had that allowed them to be very efficient and very able to conquer many of their fellow individuals that they came into contact with, their neighbors. Okay. I mean, it was a French armies under Napoleon that allowed them to actually attack and advance some 600 miles into modern day Russia. That unfortunately eventually was something that was unsuccessful. However, it was not because of any lack of food. More or less, the Russian winter is what defeated them. But they were actually able to stay supplied much of the time that they were on the move. Okay, so then in the late 1800s, we started to have something known as the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure you've been exposed to this term, so I'm not going to really go into it. But it was, among other things, it allowed armies to grow and to become more mobile. It additionally, greater technology was being utilized, and additionally, economic revolution occurred, and it allowed massive numbers of goods and services to start being created, more so than had ever been done in the history of man. This also brought with it a lot of techniques and efforts that really allowed this movement of all of these goods that were now very plentiful throughout much of Europe. Okay, movement, or I mean, accompanying this was greater communication. Communication was something that wasn't something that took place, but you had things like the telegraph that allowed individuals to start to coordinate movements of things. And they would be able to say, do you need this? I need this. We will get it to you. Things like that. Additionally, you started to have the railroad that became a thing that was going to be uh, a very big source of transportation to move not only goods but to move massive numbers of goods. Okay, so these are just some of the things that I wanted to touch on. We are going to touch on about logistics in the 20th century, but at this point, I'll stop right there and let you be. Have a good day. Bye.